Sometimes, it's not the shine of a medal that matters. It's the story buried in its rust. It's the silence behind the ribbon, and the name that was whispered during the final breath of someone who never came home. Today's story will test something deep in you, because this isn't about loud heroes or silver headlines. It's about a young girl who walked into a room wearing a medal that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. They laughed, they mocked, they pointed. But when she opened her mouth and read the words etched on a folded paper, the room changed. Hearts slowed down. Eyes burned quietly, and some of the same people who called it worthless stood up without being told to, because truth doesn't always enter a room with fireworks. Sometimes, it enters with a whisper and leaves behind a silence that speaks louder than any applause. Before we begin, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country in the comments. You have no idea how much it means to us to see all the beautiful souls gathering around these stories. Also, if you've ever been underestimated, or if someone in your family served in uniform, tell us in the comments below. Say remembered if someone you loved wore the uniform, because this story is for them. Now let me take you to the day they bullied a girl for her rusty medal until she read the citation aloud. It wasn't the shine that made the medal matter. It was the weight. The quiet kind of weight that doesn't tug your shoulders but your soul. Her name was Ellie, 13 years old, and the medal she wore around her neck didn't gleam like the others. Displayed at the school assembly, it was dull copper brown with time tarnished worn, and yet she stood straighter than any other child on the auditorium floor that morning. Not because someone told her to, but because she knew what that medal had, been through what it had survived, and who hadn't. It was Veterans Appreciation Day. Each student had been asked to bring in a photo or story of a family member who had served. Ellie had brought a box, not just a picture. A box wrapped in an old military scarf. Inside, it was a medal, a citation, and a pair of folded dog tags that rattled like ghosts when she walked. Most of the students brought in polished photos, framed flags, clean copies of certificates. Ellie's box looked like it had survived something. It looked like it had stories that didn't come with glossy finishes. That's where the teasing began. Not loud at first, but sharp. A whisper here, a giggle there. Some pointed. One boy leaned over to another and said loud enough for Ellie to hear, "That thing looks like she pulled it out of a dumpster." She didn't flinch, didn't turn, didn't react. But her fingers tightened around the medal. Ellie's teacher, Mrs. Whitmore, noticed. She had taught for over 2 decades. She had seen enough of humanity to know when a student was holding back tears with pride or shame, or both. After the assembly, Mrs. Whitmore asked Ellie if she wanted to share her story with the class. Ellie hesitated, not because she was scared, but because she wasn't sure they deserved to hear it. But then she looked at the medal again, at the scratches, the dull edges, the weight. She nodded. The next morning, the school announced during homeroom that a student would be giving a short talk at the end of the day about her family's military service. The announcement barely caused a ripple until Ellie walked up to the front of the class with that same old box. She stood in front of them, tiny, quiet. Not the kind of girl people listened to unless they had to. She opened the box and held up the medal. Some students chuckled, one rolled his eyes. But Ellie didn't blink. She unfolded the paper, hands slightly trembling, and began to read aloud. Every syllable like it had been carved into her bones for extraordinary bravery and sacrifice. On the night of April 17th, while under heavy enemy fire, Sergeant Elias Monroe carried 2 wounded soldiers to safety, refused evacuation, and returned to rescue a third. Sustained fatal injuries in the process. His actions saved lives and embodied the highest traditions of military service. That room, that noisy room, went silent. Every breath caught. Ellie's voice didn't waver. She looked up, and for the first time they saw the rust for what it really was. Not decay, but memory. Not weakness, but proof that something had endured longer than they ever could have imagined. She looked at them and spoke one more sentence. That man was my father. He never made it home. But this medal did not a word, not a sound, only the weight of truth, and the sound of something inside all of them breaking and rebuilding at once. The classroom remained quiet long after Ellie returned to her seat, not because anyone told them to be silent, but because something sacred had been shared, and they were still catching up to what it meant. The teacher didn't say anything either. She simply nodded at Ellie. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. That night, word of Ellie's story spread across the school like wind carrying ash, not with drama, but with weight. Students whispered it in hallways, parents heard about it from their kids. Even the principal called her mother to say, "That was one of the most powerful moments I've seen in my 20 years. But Ellie didn't seem to care for praise. She walked home that afternoon the same way she always did, box under one arm, her small frame battling the wind as autumn leaves chased her heels. She didn't stop at the front door. Instead, she made her way to the small backyard shed, a place that still held the smell of grease and old wood. Her father had built it before deploying, and after he was gone, it became her sanctuary inside. She opened the box again, lifted the metal carefully, ran her thumb over the ridged surface, closed her eyes. That's when the door creaked open. It was her mother, still in her work uniform, eyes tired but soft. She didn't ask anything, just sat beside Ellie on the bench. After a few quiet minutes, she said, "He would have been proud of you today." So proud. Ellie nodded, but didn't speak. Instead, she pulled out the citation again and read it aloud. Not for the students this time, but for her own heart. For years, she had memorized those words. Each syllable felt like a footprint left by her father. Each sentence a map that led her closer to him. She imagined him in uniform. She imagined him smiling when he saw her walk across the school floor with his medal on her neck. She imagined what he might have whispered to her if he could have been there. Outside the shed, the wind picked up, chimes danced on the porch, and a gust of air slipped through the wooden cracks, carrying with it the faint scent of tobacco and engine oil, the smell she remembered from the few nights he tucked her in. The next morning, something was different. Ellie walked into school, and instead of hearing the whispers, she saw silence. Not the awkward kind, but the respectful kind. One of the boys who had laughed nodded at her. A few students even stepped aside to let her pass in the hallway. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her story had already done the talking. But the real change came later that week. When the school announced a veterans wall would be added near the front office, students could submit photos and names of their relatives who served. And it would become a living memory for the entire campus. Ellie was asked to write the dedication letter. She didn't hesitate. She wrote, "To the ones who came home, to the ones who didn't, and to the ones who still carry the weight quietly. This wall is not to celebrate war, but to honor the silence that follows, the moments that never make the news, the medals that rust, and the hearts that remember. We build this not with bricks, but with names, with stories, and with the kind of love that doesn't fade." When the letter was read aloud during morning announcements, several teachers wiped tears from their cheeks. Students who had never cared about the military suddenly began asking questions about their grandfathers, their uncles, their neighbors. Ellie had become a bridge between generations, a girl with a dusty box and a story too powerful to ignore. As the weeks passed, something began to shift in the school, not dramatically, but like the slow turning of leaves before fall. You didn't notice the change all at once, but one morning the whole place looked different. The Veterans Wall became more than a project. It became a gathering place. Students passed by and paused, some with curiosity, others with reverence. Some just stood silently, reading the names, touching the laminated photos. As if those simple gestures could carry their gratitude to another world, Ellie's name wasn't on the wall, but her father's was Sergeant Elias Monroe, and beneath it, a small quote from her dedication letter. "Medals rust, but memory doesn't." That quote caught on. Teachers printed it. One girl painted it in calligraphy and hung it in the hallway. Another student made a bracelet that simply said, "Remember, rust." The teasing that once circled Ellie disappeared. Not because anyone made a rule, but because respect had been planted, and it bloomed where cruelty once stood, but not everyone understood. Not at first. There was one boy, Derek, who hadn't joined. Asked the change. He was tall, loud. The kind of kid who carried sarcasm like armor. He was one of the first to mock Ellie's medal weeks ago, and even now. While the others shifted, he stood apart. Until the day his grandmother came to pick him up early, she walked in slowly with a cane and thick glasses, wrinkles like rivers across her face, but her voice was steady. She asked the receptionist, "Where's the veterans?" Wall. The secretary walked her over. Derek followed behind, confused quiet for once, when they reached the wall. She stood still, looking at the names, eyes scanning, not with interest, but with intent. Then she found it, and her lips trembled. There, on the third row, was a name Derek had never heard before. Private Harold Jameson, her brother, killed in action, 1944. She turned to Derek and whispered, "I haven't seen his name anywhere in over 50 years. But it's here because of a girl. You mocked that girl. But she gave me this moment." Derek didn't speak. Not then, not in the car, not even that evening. But the next morning, he stood in front of Ellie's desk, fidgeting hands in his hoodie pockets. When she looked up, he said one sentence. "I'm sorry about what I said about the medal, about all of it." Ellie looked at him, not with anger, not with pride, just a quiet nod. Then she opened her notebook, pulled out a blank sheet, wrote something down, folded it, and handed it to him. Later that day, Derek opened the paper in his locker. It read, "Rust means it's been through something and still survived." By the time winter approached, Ellie had become known not for being loud, not for being the best in class, but for something that couldn't be measured with grades or trophies. She was the girl who brought the rusted medal, the girl who read the citation aloud, the girl who reminded them all that some stories are carried, not told on Veterans Day. The school held a ceremony, not in a gym, but outside. Near the flagpole where the wind could carry the words into the trees, Ellie had been asked to speak, again. But this time she didn't bring the medal. She didn't need to. She stepped up to the small podium, looked at the gathered students, the teachers' parents, a few local veterans in folding chairs, and she said, "I used to think people needed medals to remember. But now, I think they just need stories. So I'm going to tell you one more." She spoke of her father, not as a soldier, but as a man who loved motorcycles and blueberry pancakes, a man who carried a photo of her in his vest pocket, a man who once fixed her favorite doll's leg with duct tape and called it battlefield surgery. The crowd laughed softly at that, and something about the cold air made every word feel crisper, like her breath was carving truth into the sky. She ended with, "This, my father died in service, but his love never left. It stayed in this school, in this wall, in every heart that heard his name. You don't have to carry medals, just carry memory." When she finished, there was no applause, not because it wasn't deserved, but because clapping felt too small, too ordinary for what had just been said. Instead, one by one, people stood in silence, in honor. Even the principal wiped his eyes, and standing at the edge of the crowd, Derek, the boy who had once laughed, stood with both hands at his side, staring at Ellie like he had just seen something that changed him forever. After the ceremony, a veteran in a wheelchair rolled up to Ellie. He had deep creases around his eyes, a ball cap that read Vietnam. He reached into his coat, pulled out a patch, faded threadbare. He held it out. I wore this on my last tour, thought it was mine, but turns out it was just holding a place for someone like you, Ellie. Took it with both hands and bowed her head. That night, back in her room, Maid pinned the patch to a canvas on her wall, beside a photo of her father and the citation she had read aloud. The medal still rested in its box. Untouched, but more seen than ever before, she sat on the edge of her bed, looked at the patch, the photo, the citation, and whispered, "I hope I did it right, Dad. I hope I told it the way you would have wanted." Outside snow began to fall, quiet, soft, like the world itself had paused to remember a man, a girl, and a story made of rust and courage. December moved, slowly that year, like the world had decided to breathe a little deeper. And for the first time in a long time, Ellie wasn't invisible anymore. But it wasn't popularity. It was something different, something quieter, more lasting. She was no longer the girl with a rusty medal. She was the one who reminded everyone why names mattered, why silence sometimes carried more power than sound on the last day before winter break. Mrs. Whitmore invited Ellie to stay after class. She said, "I know you've given this school a great deal already, but there's something else I'd like to ask you." Ellie nodded. Not out of obligation, but because she trusted Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. They always looked like they'd seen hard things and chosen to stay kind. Anyway, Mrs. Whitmore opened a drawer and pulled out a thin blue folder. Inside were letters, typed, folded. Some handwritten, all addressed to Ellie, dozens of them, from parents, from veterans, from students, from strangers who had heard her story. One read, "Your courage brought me back to my brother's memory. I had forgotten how much he mattered." Another said, "My son never came home, and I stopped talking about him. You gave me permission to speak again." Ellie read through each one, quietly, her fingers brushing across the ink, as if it might smear if she blinked too fast. She asked, "Why are they sending these to me?" Mrs. Whitmore smiled softly. "Because you carried the memory, and people need permission to carry theirs too." That night, Ellie didn't sleep. Right away, she kept the folder on her bed, laid next to it like it was a person, and reread every line. She realized something. Grief wasn't just something you held. It was something you could hand off, not to get rid of it, but to let others help carry it. In January, when school resumed, the Veterans Wall had new additions. A small box beneath it labeled, "Share Your Story." Students could drop in notes, photos, drawings, even poems. Ellie was asked to help curate what would go on the wall each month. Became, in her own quiet way, the school's memory keeper. But something else happened too, in the hallway near the library. Someone had added a small plaque, a quote engraved in brushed steel. It read. She read the citation aloud, and we all heard it. Not just in our ears, but in our hearts. No name was listed, but everyone knew who it was, for Derek passed it every day, and every time he saw it, he tapped the edge with his finger, not for luck, but for grounding. Later that month, he asked Ellie if she wanted help sorting the submission box. They sat side by side after school, reading poems, unfolding drawings, laughing at some, crying at others. One of the notes was just a single line. My grandpa told me he never cried about the war, but he did when he saw your speech on the school's YouTube. Ellie looked up, eyes wide. YouTube, she whispered. Derek blinked. You didn't know. The school uploaded the assembly. It has over 30,000 views. She stared, not with fear, not with excitement, but with the kind of stillness that only comes when you realize your voice had traveled farther than you ever imagined. She asked, did people say anything? Mean? He shook his head. Just one comment. Said the medal looked old. But someone replied and said, that's why it's real. Ellie smiled for the first time in a long time, without pain behind it. February brought a wind that cut through coats, but Ellie didn't mind the cold anymore. Something about the air reminded her of her father, the way he used to. Let the wind whip through the open truck window, laughing like it was a friend. She had started to smile more now, not because life had gotten easier, but because she had grown stronger. But even strength has its tests. One morning, a substitute teacher entered their classroom. A woman in her late 40s, short hair, glasses that didn't quite hide the sadness in her eyes. Her name was Ms. Halpern. She didn't say much, but she had a gentle way of taking attendance. Like every name she spoke had a story. She didn't want to mispronounce at the end of the class. She asked Ellie to stay for a moment. Ellie froze, worried she had done something wrong, but Ms. Halpern just smiled. I saw your video, she said softly, the one where you read the citation. It was beautiful. Ellie blinked. You saw it, yes, she replied. My husband served with your father. The room spun, not wildly, but like the world was gently turning itself to face something forgotten. Miss Halpern reached into her purse and pulled out an old envelope, edges curled. Name written in blue pen. This, she said, was meant for you? Ellie took it with both hands, fingers trembling, heart pounding. She looked at the name, her own written in her father's handwriting. She didn't speak. She couldn't take. Your time, Ms. Halpern said, but I thought you should have it. That night, Ellie sat on her bed, everything quiet. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside, a single letter. It began, My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, then something happened that I couldn't stop. But don't be afraid. This letter isn't about goodbye, it's about everything I wanted to tell you. I carried your picture into every mission. When things got loud, I'd hold it. And suddenly, it was quiet again. Your laugh. Your tiny feet running across the kitchen floor. The way you once told me I was your superhero. It kept me alive. But Ellie, you're going to grow up in a world where people might forget why things matter. They might see rust and call it ruin. They might hear silence and think it's emptiness, but you'll know better. You'll know that rust means survival, that silence carries honor, that love doesn't vanish. It changes form. Promise me this. When the time comes, tell the story. Even if your voice shakes, even if no one claps, even if the medal looks dull, tell it anyway. Because truth, real truth, outlives everything. Ellie pressed the letter to her chest. She didn't cry. Not right away. The tears came later, when her mom found her sitting quietly. Letter in her lap, eyes closed. She whispered, He wrote to me. Her mom didn't ask what it said. She didn't need to. She just sat beside her and wrapped her in arms that had once held both of them together through the kind of storms that never make the news. The next morning, Ellie brought the letter to school, not to show, but to keep close. A warmth in her backpack. That day she added one more item to the veterans' wall, a new quote, typed neatly on a white card. Tell the story, even if your voice shakes, even if. No one claps, even if the medal looks dull, tell it anyway. March arrived with the scent of fresh grass and rain-soaked pavement. And something else, too. Something invisible, but heavy. A feeling that the story Ellie carried was beginning to ripple beyond the fences of her small school. It started with a phone call. The principal called Ellie and her mother into his office. His tone serious but eyes kind. He said, "We received a letter from the state's Department of Veterans Affairs. Someone saw Ellie's story online, and they'd like to invite her to speak at the Capitol for Memorial Day." Ellie blinked. The Capitol. In front of actual soldiers, leaders, strangers. Her mother squeezed her hand. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." But Ellie didn't hesitate. She nodded, eyes calm. "If they want to hear the story, I'll tell it." In the weeks that followed, something beautiful happened. The entire school rallied behind her. Students helped her build a presentation board. Teachers offered their support. Even Derek, the boy who once mocked her, designed a digital slideshow of her father's pictures with quiet music behind it. Ellie practiced each evening, not with notes, but with memory. She didn't memorize her speech. She remembered it. She remembered her father's laugh, the creak of the porch swing, the way he once knelt and tied her shoelaces, even when he was running late for drill. And when Memorial Day finally came, Ellie stood at the steps of the Capitol, wearing her father's jacket over her dress, the medal tucked gently. Inside her palm, hundreds of people sat before her, veterans with their families, children, reporters, strangers holding tiny flags. When her name was called, she walked to the microphone, every step steady, as if she was walking beside him. She looked out at the sea of faces. Then she began. "My father, Sergeant Elias Monroe, never came home, but he never really left either. I wear his medal, not to show what he did, but to carry what he gave. And sometimes, what we carry looks old, looks rusty, but that's how you know it survived." She told them about the citation, the classroom, the silence, the wall. She didn't cry. Not until the very end, when she said, "This isn't just my story, it's yours. It's every folded flag, every whisper at a graveside, every child who wears courage like a second skin." When she finished, there was silence. Not because they didn't want to applaud, but because applause felt too small again, too human for something that's sacred. Then one by one, people began to rise. A ripple of standing, a tide of respect. The governor approached, handed her a plaque, said, "You reminded us all what honor really means." Reporters asked for interviews. Veterans embraced her. But Ellie only looked for one person, a man in the back row, dressed simply, eyes red, Medal of Honor on his chest. He approached, slowly introduced himself as Colonel Raymond Ellis. He said, "I served with your father on his final tour. He saved my life." Ellie gasped. Her fingers gripped the medal tighter. He looked at her gently. "I was there the night he earned that citation. He called out your name before he went back in. Said, 'Tell Ellie I love her.'" Ellie's breath caught. The colonel reached into his coat, pulled out a photograph. It showed 3 men, one of them her father. Younger, smiling, sunlight on his face. "I've carried this in my Bible ever since, but I think it belongs with you now." Ellie took the photo with both hands. She couldn't speak, so she just nodded. Eyes full later that evening. She placed the photo beside the letter, the citation, and the medal, and for the first time, she felt like the story wasn't just being told, it was being completed. After Memorial Day, things didn't go back to normal. They went forward. Ellie had returned to school, but something in her had shifted. She wasn't just a student now. She had become something more, a keeper of legacy, a thread between generations, the kind that doesn't just carry a story but becomes part of it. Back in her bedroom, her wall of memory had grown: the letter, the patch, the photo, the medal, and now the plaque from the Capitol. Each piece held with care, Not because they were things, but because they were echoes. Echoes of love, of service, of sacrifice. But Ellie didn't keep it all to herself. She asked, "Mrs. Whitmore, can we do more than just remember? Can we teach?" And so, with the help of a few teachers and some local veterans, Ellie created a student-led memory project. Each student could pick a name from the veterans' wall, research them, write about them, share what they learned. It wasn't just about facts, it was about feeling, about turning strangers into stories, turning photos into people. The project spread, other schools heard about it. Then a local newspaper, then a regional broadcast. Ellie was invited to speak again, but this time at a middle school in a neighboring town. She walked into their auditorium, smaller than hers. But full, she wore the same jacket, held the same citation. But this time, she also brought something else, an empty frame. She placed it on the podium and said, "This frame is for the name you haven't heard yet, the story you haven't told, the person who deserves to be remembered but is still waiting for someone to speak for them." That line stuck. Teachers took it back to their classrooms, and soon the frame became a tradition. Each school placed an empty frame on their veterans' display, a symbol of the story still untold, the name not yet remembered, the soldier still waiting, and in every school it started with one voice. A girl who once carried a rusty medal, but the ripples didn't stop there one evening. While Ellie was helping her mother clean out the attic, they found an old box marked E. Inside were tapes, audio tapes, letters, postcards from her father. He had recorded stories, not of war, but of home, of her first birthday, of the time she fell in the mud and laughed so hard she got the hiccups, of how he hoped one day she'd grow up brave enough to speak when others stayed silent. Her mother placed a hand on Ellie's shoulder. He never knew if he'd come home, but he tried to bring pieces of home to you anyway. Ellie spent the next month digitizing the tapes. She listened to his voice over and over until it felt like he was still here. Then she had an idea with the help of her school's tech club. She created a podcast each episode. She shared a veteran's story, sometimes told by a relative, sometimes by Ellie herself, sometimes just her father's voice. The podcast was called Voices That Stayed, and within a few weeks, thousands were listening. Teachers played it during class. Families gathered around the dinner table to hear an episode. Veterans sent in their own stories to be read by Ellie's gentle voice. She never called herself famous. She didn't want to be. She called herself a listener, that she said is the most important kind of storyteller, because you don't carry the truth by shouting it, you carry it by honoring it. Ellie's podcast had reached places she never expected: nursing homes, firehouses, base libraries, and even the waiting rooms of VA hospitals. But despite the growing attention, she remained grounded. She still ate lunch at the same table, still helped clean the chalkboard after class, still visited the shed, where her father once kept his tools. That sheet had become more than a place now. It was a small museum of memory, and Ellie never let anyone in until one rainy afternoon. She heard a knock on the wooden frame. It was Mrs. Whitmore. She asked, "May I, Ellie?" Hesitated, then stepped aside. Mrs. Whitmore walked slowly, eyes scanning the walls, photographs, patches, notes, dog tags hanging like wind chimes that chose not to make a sound. She looked at Ellie. "You've built something sacred here." Ellie nodded. "It's where I hear him the clearest." Mrs. Whitmore smiled, then reached into her satchel and pulled out something unexpected, a photo faded, cracked. It showed a younger Mrs. Whitmore, wearing an army uniform. "I don't talk about it much," she said, "but I served." Ellie looked at her surprised. Honored Mrs. Whitmore placed the photo gently on a small shelf, beside the others, then sat on the wooden bench. "I kept it hidden, because people didn't listen. Back then, Didn't believe we had stories worth telling. Ellie sat beside her. You can tell me. And she did. For the next hour, Mrs. Whitmore spoke in a tone Ellie had never heard from her before. Wounds hidden under chalk dust and report cards. Memories folded between lesson plans. When she finished, Ellie said, "You should come on the podcast." Mrs. Whitmore shook her head gently. "No, but you can tell it for me." That evening, Ellie recorded a new episode. Her voice steady, but her heart full. She spoke, not just for her father, but for Mrs. Whitmore and for every veteran, whose silence had stretched too long. She ended with a line that caught fire across the internet. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is come home and say nothing. But sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask them anyway. That episode, titled "The Teacher Who Waited," became the most downloaded of the series, and something shifted again. More teachers spoke up, more quiet heroes came forward. Ellie realized silence wasn't the absence of story. It was the waiting room for it weeks later. On a Saturday morning, Ellie was invited to a veterans' breakfast in a neighboring town. She wasn't asked to speak, just attend. She arrived early, wearing a navy sweater, hair pulled back, medal tucked under her collar as she sat down. An older man across the table squinted at her. "Are you the podcast girl?" She nodded. "Ellie Monroe?" He smiled, reached into his coat, and placed a crumpled napkin in front of her. On it was a hand-drawn picture of a little girl holding hands with a soldier. "That's my granddaughter," he said. "She listened to your episode, then drew this for me, said she never knew her papa was a hero." Ellie held the napkin like it was a relic. Her eyes misted. Not from sorrow, but from recognition. She had always told stories, but now they were becoming seeds, planting memories where there had once been none. Before the breakfast ended, one of the organizers came to the front. "We have a surprise guest." He turned to Ellie. "Your father's commanding officer is here." The room turned, and from the back, a tall man stepped forward. Gray hair, uniform, sharp eyes locked on Ellie. He saluted and said, "Your father saved my life, too. I've spent 20 years carrying that with me, never knowing how to give it back. How I do." He reached into a small velvet pouch, pulled out a silver compass. This was his. I kept it because I couldn't let go, but it's yours now. Ellie took it with trembling hands. The compass was scratched, edges dulled, but the needle still pointed true. She held it against her chest and whispered, "Thank you." Spring melted into summer, and the town where Ellie lived began to bloom in ways no one had expected. Flags appeared on porches that hadn't flown in years. Local kids asked their grandparents for stories they had never cared to hear before. The Veterans Wall at her school became a destination, not just for remembrance, but for learning. And Ellie, she kept going, kept speaking, kept listening. She didn't need microphones anymore. Sometimes she would sit beside someone at a cafe or at a park bench and just say, "Tell me." One of those days, she sat with a woman named Rose 86. Wrinkled hands, eyes that still carried thunder. Rose was once a combat nurse in Korea. She said, "I saw things no one ever asked me about until you." Ellie took her hand, then asked the question she had asked so many times before. "Do you want me to tell your story?" Rose smiled. "Only if you tell it gently," and she did. But Ellie had something else growing inside her now. Not just stories, but an idea. She wanted to build something permanent, something that didn't rely on headphones or screens. She pitched it to the town council. A memory garden, not a cemetery, not a museum. A place where stories bloomed, where each flower bed was planted in honor of a name, where QR codes on smooth stones linked to podcast episodes, where benches held quotes carved deep like veins in stone. The council listened, they nodded but asked who would pay for it. Ellie simply said, "We will." She started a fundraiser, spoke at events, wrote letters, made posters, and something beautiful happened. People gave, not just money, but time labor. Land, a local nursery donated every flower. A veteran-owned construction company laid the paths for free. One artist carved a sculpture of a rusted metal, larger than life, at the entrance. Months passed, and by fall, the memory garden stood complete. At the opening ceremony, people gathered, some in suits, some in wheelchairs, some in silence. Ellie stood before them, wearing her father's compass, her voice steady. She said, "We built this, not with bricks, but with love, with names, with the belief that memory matters more than medals. This is not a place to mourn, but a place to remember, to sit, to breathe, to listen." She reached into her pocket, pulled out her father's citation, and placed it under a glass frame on the central stone. Then she added one more line beneath it: "He lived with honor. Now we live with memory." After the ceremony, a little girl tugged on Ellie's sleeve. She said, "I brought my grandpa's medal, but it's kind of ugly, it's not shiny." Ellie knelt too. Her level held her hand and whispered, "That just means it has a story." The girl smiled and handed it over. Ellie placed it gently on the offering stone, where people could leave tokens for display, not locked behind glass, but in the open, where rain and sun could bless them. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the sculpture, Ellie stood alone in the garden, listening to the wind. It sounded like paper turning, like pages still being written. Her mother walked up behind her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than remember him. You've made him live again. In every story, in every child, in every flower that grows here." Ellie nodded, and for the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the metal. She felt its light. Autumn returned, with gold-colored leaves that danced like confetti across the paths of the memory garden. Visitors kept coming. Some brought photos. Others brought stories. Many brought silence. But they all left something behind. Ellie had become part of the rhythm of the garden. She didn't need to guide people. She simply greeted them, sat with them, listened. She had long stopped reading from papers. Now she spoke from the inside out. But there was one place she had not yet gone. Not since the ceremony. Not since the medals. Not since the folded flag came home. The cemetery she had visited once as a child after the funeral, but never again. Not because she didn't care, but because she wasn't ready. Now she was. It happened on a quiet Sunday. No announcement. No camera. Just Ellie. A bouquet of marigolds and her father's compass tucked in her jacket. She walked through rows of stones. Each name another thread, another chapter, another weight. Someone once carried. Then she saw it: Elias Monroe, Sergeant Beloved, Father Bravery, beyond measure. The stone was simple, unadorned, but the earth around it was soft, as if it had been waiting for something. Ellie knelt, not to cry, but to breathe. She placed the flowers gently, then took the compass from her pocket. She opened. It watched the needle spin. Then settle, she whispered. You were always mine. North, no one heard her, but the trees seemed to lean closer. She took out a small speaker, pressed play. Her podcast voice, the one she used for strangers, now played back her own words. The episode where she read the citation aloud, where she spoke about him. For him, the sound floated into the wind, and she imagined for just a moment that he was sitting beside her, boots, dusty elbows on knees, smiling like he used to when he knew something she didn't. She looked around, gravestones quiet still, but not forgotten. Before she stood to leave, she reached into her bag, pulled out a small glass vial inside a handful of soil from the memory garden. She poured a pinch onto the grave. Now, he was connected, not just by blood but by roots, the garden and the stone, the beginning and the end, all part of the same story. As she stood, she felt a presence. She didn't turn, didn't need to. It wasn't someone. It was something. A sense that her father had been listening, that he had heard every word, every story, every rusted metal she held in trembling hands. She whispered one last thing. I kept the promise, I told the story, even when my voice shook. Then she walked away, not with sorrow, but with peace. The compass still in her hand. Spinning gently in the breeze, time moved forward as it always does. But some moments, some names, some stories refused to fade. Ellie didn't stop. She didn't retreat into the quiet once the spotlight dimmed. She just let the work become quieter. Deeper, more personal. The podcast continued, though now it was co-hosted by former students, volunteers, veterans who had once sat in the crowd. Now sitting behind the mic, the memory garden expanded one bench at a time, one flower bed at a time. People began to send items from across the country, medals, photographs, dog tags, even handwritten letters from wars long past, and Ellie, still young, still growing, became the steward of all of it. Not a historian, not a celebrity, but a keeper. She spoke less in assemblies now, and more in living rooms, libraries, front porches, where the real stories waited, unpolished, unrecorded, but no less sacred. Every year on Memorial Day, she would return to the Capitol. Not always, to speak. Sometimes just to listen. Sometimes to place a new flower, a new quote, a new rusted name in the garden of remembrance, and sometimes just to sit alone with a notebook, a pencil, and a folded letter still kept safe in her bag. Years passed. A school where it all began, replaced old posters, painted new walls. Teachers came and went, but one thing remained. The plaque engraved into the stone just outside the auditorium. It read, she read the citation aloud, and we all heard it. Not just in our ears, but in our hearts. Generations of students would pass by that plaque, most never knowing the full story, but all feeling something when they did. Because Ellie's gift was never about her voice. It was about how her voice helped others find their own. She had turned rust into reverence, silence into storytelling, grief into gardens, and in doing so, she showed the world what a single act of courage can become when it is carried gently, repeated faithfully, and passed down like a torch. One winter afternoon, now older Ellie returned to the memory garden alone. Snow fell gently, blanketing every name, every flower bed. She walked the path slowly, wearing the same jacket, the compass still in her pocket. She reached the sculpture of the rusted metal, brushed snow from its base, then sat on the nearest bench. She looked around. No cameras, no crowds, just silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. She closed her eyes, listened to the wind, and there, in the quiet, she felt it again. Not sorrow, not pride, but presence. Like her father was there, not behind her, not above her, but within her, and with a soft voice she whispered. I remember she stood, brushed snow from her coat, and walked out of the garden, not to leave it behind, but to carry it with her into every school, every story, every child who thinks their medal is too dull to matter. And one day, when she would no longer be the one telling the stories, she would smile, knowing someone else would, because stories, when told with love, never end. They echo forever.